Hi everyone, welcome to the first episode of sound design for video games. Today we're going to be looking into the Metasound system inside of Unreal Engine. Let's get started. Now the first thing we should go over is how to create a Metasound. It's very simple, simply right click in the little panel area here, go to Audio, Metasound Source, and it will create one. What we're going to call this is ms_demo. And if I double click this, this is what we are greeted with. So we have a few things that we are showing here. We have an on-play trigger input. We have a output audio, which is, you can tell it's audio because it's a little pink pin here. And here we have an output on finished. So to speak very briefly about what this is, an on-play trigger input basically means when this play button is hit here, a trigger is sent through whatever this is connected to. On output finished, let's say we did something like this. Let's say we did a trigger delay, just something very simple. And we'll set that delay to 2 seconds. And we'll just tag that over to the output here, connect that up there. Now if I press play, what's going to happen is this on play is going to fire off. This trigger delay is going to hold that impulse for 2 seconds, and then it's going to output that impulse into the outputs, which will then cause the Metasound to stop because it is finished. So I'll demonstrate that now. And after 2 seconds, you can see very quickly it fired off there. And that causes the Metasound to stop. Now, when you're creating sounds, obviously you need to connect them up so that they go to an output, and that's where this comes in, the output mono. We'll go into that in more detail in our little demo that I've set up in just a moment. And here is the Metasound demo that I've created. It's very simple. Basically, it is 2 tone generators, a saw wave and a square wave. And what they're going to do is they're going to start at a lower tone and then they're going to sweep up to a higher tone. And once it's completed that, it's then going to finish and the Metasound will stop. I'll demonstrate that now if I press play. So you can see it's a very simple Metasound we've created. It's just something to help us get our heads around the very basics. Now what I want to talk about is inputs and outputs. We have a few of them in this little demo right now. We have a trigger input. We have a trigger input here. We have a trigger output. Here we have an audio output. And what inputs and outputs basically are is they are the start of a chain of logic, or you could call this data flow, as the data flows from left to right. And the outputs are the end of that data flow. So you can see this input is firing data off here into the trigger delay, and this output is receiving that at the end, which is then going to create some functionality. Same here, the input is firing off. We have some functionality here. We have tone generators, a little bit of a mixing area. And then finally, the audio is going to go to the audio outputs. So that's what inputs and outputs are. Now the next thing I want to talk about is the differences between linear gain and decibels. Now what we have here in our little mixing area, the tone generators are coming into a mono mixer with these little brackets which say 2. Now what you can do is you can drag off this, you can say mixer, and you can have like an 8 mixer if you want to. Since we're only dealing with 2 mono audio samples, a mono mixer 2 is fine. Now you can see here we have these little green pins, and here it says gain 0 and then in brackets lin, which stands for linear. Now here it says 0.5. Now what does that mean? 0.5, if we're talking about decibels, would mean we are adding 0.5 decibels. But with linear gain, what 0.5 means, it means we are actually halving the input that it's received. So if we say, for instance, let's talk in terms of voltages. Let's say out of this audio here, we have a saw wave, which has an amplitude of plus minus 2 volts. It's coming in here, and we say, well, we want 0.5 of this signal to be mixed in with this, which is a way of saying we don't want 2 volts, we want 1 volt, which will eventually come out of here from this saw wave. Now here we have connected up a decibels to linear gain. It's very simple to get, just drag off, type in decibels, and you can find it here, decibels to linear gain. This has already done all the calculations, which allows any numbers you feed into here to be treated as decibels, and it will turn them into a linear gain value, which can then be received by the mono mixer. So we have this decibels to linear gain, and then out of this we have what's called a graph input. I'll go and create a new one of them just for demonstration purposes. If I drag off this and say promote to graph inputs, you can see we have this little dial here that goes to -6 to 0. We can change its ranges over here. So if I go and I change it to say -24, and I'll change this to +24. We can also change the way it looks if we want to. So you can change it from a knob to a slider like I have here. And you can change it from horizontal to vertical, depending on how you want it to look. And you see it will go from 24 to -24. Now, what's the major differences from these types of inputs if you're working with decibels or linear gain? The major difference is with linear gain, you don't want to ever be writing in negative values. With decibels, it's very common. It's something that I've done a lot in my career, always saying, oh, I want -6 decibels for, I don't know, a guitar that's being mixed in a track, for instance. With linear gain, if you type in negative values, you can end up with some very strange sounds coming out where it's actually very loud, or it'll create like a glitchy sort of sound at times. I'm not going to demonstrate it for you because it can be quite horrible. So I'm just making you aware of that, because if you're not aware of it, it can be a bit of a shock when you do it for the first time. So it's something to just keep in mind. Now let's take a brief look at the Metasound settings. Now, if you're looking over here, if you just go to the top left over here, you can see the little gear icon and it says Metasound. If I click on this, we have some settings that we can change here. The most important one I wanted to point to here is the output format. So you can see we have a mono. Now if you look over here, that is what's giving us this output here. So if you're dealing with a stereo sound, for instance, you can take this drop down menu and you can change this to anything you like. You can change it to a stereo, a quad output, a 5.1 or a 7.1 surround sound output. Just to demonstrate this, let's change it to a stereo. You can see now we have an output left and an output right. So if I play this now, you should only hear it through the left speaker. And there you go. You can easily change it back. You can change it back to mono. And there you go, it's back to output mono. That's the major thing I want to draw your attention to. If you want, you can change things like the display name, the description, the author, and various things like that. I'm not going to go into too much detail on the source settings over here, but basically you have a few macro controls over here, like the volume, the pitch, the class, which is kind of beyond the scope of this episode right now. You have things like attenuation settings, effects like source effects. So later on, if you're like wanting to send this sound to reverbs or delays or anything, any type of effect you can think of, this is the place where you would do that. I just wanted to make you aware of it. It's not really something that we need to know at this point, but it's something later on the course we will be getting into. Now let's talk about graph inputs. If I take this saw wave and I drag off the frequency node here, I can say promote to graph input. Now what I've created here is a float graph input. You can tell it's a float graph input because the little pin here is green. There are lots of different types of inputs you can create. You can create an audio graph input. So if I go over here, you can see this is a little pink pin, which means audio. If I drag off this, you can see promote to graph inputs. If I drag off a white one, which is a trigger, I can create a trigger graph input. Each one is going to have different uses depending on what you want to do. As we get further into the series, it's going to become more and more apparent what each one is good for and useful for. But just for the sake of demonstrating this, let's set this input up for this sawtooth wave. I'm going to give it a minimum range of 60. I'm going to give it a maximum range of 400. And now when I press play, or what I should do is go to the trigger delay, and let's just make that 20 seconds so that we've got 20 seconds before the Metasound automatically stops. Now if I press play, you can see that what we have here is a little dial that can change the frequency of the saw wave. And that's basically graph inputs. Like I said, there are many different ones and they all have different uses. But just for now, that will do for our explanation of graph inputs. Now let's finish off here by going over the overall functionality of this entire Metasound. So on the top here, we basically have some trigger inputs, which are, we have a trigger input and a trigger output. So what we're doing is we're saying when the Metasound is played, we're going to fire off here. We're going to go into trigger delay. It's going to hold that for 2 seconds and that's going to fire off onto the on finished. So on play is when the Metasound is played. So you see it's fired off. Now when it hits on finished, that's the equivalent of hitting the stop button. You're saying I want this Metasound to stop. Now from here we have essentially the audio section. This is where we are making the audio happen and processing it or modulating it in a certain way. So once again we have an on play, which is when essentially this is clicked, or if it's triggered from another blueprint. So you could say from another blueprint, when this happens, I want this Metasound to play, and that will be the same as essentially hitting this play button. So here we have some logic for a simple frequency slide. We have a trigger delay, which is set to 0.1 seconds. This trigger delay is feeding into a value float. And what we are essentially doing is we're saying before 0.1 seconds, this value float is going to output the value of 80 because it's the initial value. After 0.1 seconds, we're triggering this float to then output the value of 100. So we're going from 80 Hz to 100 Hz, and it happens instantly. It goes from 80 to 100 like that. Now, because it does it instantly, we want it to slide. What we're then going into is an interp 2. And basically an interp 2, it has two elements. It has the time element, see we've got 0.1 seconds, and it has the target value. So this is receiving 80 before 0.1 seconds, and then after 0.1 seconds, this is receiving the value 100. And what it's going to do is it's going to interpolate to that value for a degree of time, over a degree of time, to try and explain that properly. So over 0.1 seconds, it's going to gradually make that value go up. So if I change this to 1 second, it would go from 80 to 100 Hz over 1 second. I'll demonstrate that now. So let's change it to 1. So you can see it's a very gradual slide up. If I change that to 0, there'll be no interpolation. It will instantly go from 80 to 100. If I change it to 0.5, so you can change the degree of how that data changes, essentially over time. Now this is fed into the frequency of the tone generators. Now you might not be using tone generators, and in fact you won't be always using tone generators. What you can also use is a wave player. A wave player is going to allow you to load up a wave asset, which is essentially audio that you've imported or audio that's already inside of the engine. So say for instance we load up this clap sound, and then out of these audio outputs here we can plug these into the mixer, and basically these will play when they are triggered. But here we are using tone generators, so I'm just going to keep with these for now. Now, out of the tone generators, we're coming into this mixing section. What we have is a mono mixer. And you can see we have the audio going into gain 0 and gain 1 of both these. And then we have a section where we can control the volume of these two and mix them. So for instance, let's say we want no square wave. We can bring this down. So that was pure sawtooth wave there. Let's say we want lots of square wave. We can bring this up. Now it's more square orientated. Now this little bit here is essentially an overall volume control. It's basically the audio going into a multiply audio node. So you would do that by simply dragging off here. Press star on your keyboard and you can say audio by float. And this is where it is. And then from here, you can see we've got this graph input where we have it set to 0.1. So we're basically making the sound 10%. So it's a very quiet sound. If we had that full blast, it would be really loud for the video. And then out of here, we are outputting to out mono. And then that's what it creates. It creates this sound. So there you go. Now that's everything for this episode. Thank you very much for watching. We will be going into more depth later on in the series, but until then, take it easy. I'll catch you next time.